Good afternoon, and welcome to this American Enterprise Institute event, which we hope you'll find both enlightening and entertaining. I'm Kevin Kosar, a resident scholar with AEI's Social, Cultural, and Constitutional Studies group. Before going any further, I want to thank my colleagues Nicole Penn, Elaine Allen, and the many other staff who helped us arrange this event. December 5th was the 87th anniversary of the repeal of prohibition. This policy was a remarkable one, not least because it was enacted via a constitutional amendment in 1919, and then repealed by a constitutional amendment in 1933. Making policy through constitutional amendments, obviously, is a pretty unusual thing. Around 100 laws are enacted each year by Congress on average, but we've only had 8 constitutional amendments in the past century, and 2 of them were devoted to alcohol, remarkably enough. The policy of prohibition banned the sale or trafficking of fermented and distilled beverages. Its proponents argued that the ban would reduce various social ills, including alcoholism, domestic abuse, violence, and poverty. The proponents of it were polyglot and included various Christian groups, women's rights organizations, progressives, health advocates, industrialists, and even nativists. Opponents, well, they were many. And the battle over drink had many social dimensions, including religion, class, and gender. And as we'll hear today from our panelists, this battle over drink is age-old in America, and it had been brewing, so to speak, for a long time. Now, whatever benefits prohibition may have brought, ultimately, as a national policy, it was a failure, not least because so much of the American public disliked it and refused to obey it. In retrospect, the collapse of this so-called noble experiment is unsurprising. It involved an attempt by a minority coalition to use governmental authority to stop Americans from doing something they had been doing since Europeans landed in North America. Drink was deeply woven into American life, folkways, and the economy. Now, the title of today's event is From Fish House Punch to Bud Light. No doubt you are all more or less familiar with Bud Light, the mass-produced light lager sold around the globe and dispensed in big plastic cups at concerts and sporting events and sold through television commercials. About 27 million barrels, or about 9 billion cans of it, were produced last year alone. Less familiar to you, maybe Fish House Punch. This was a local drink, first conjured up at some point in the 18th century at a small Philadelphia fishing and hunting club. The members of the club made the punch in a huge bowl that doubled as a baptismal font. And the recipe included peach brandy, cognac, rum, sugar, lemon juice, and water. A single serving of this punch for just one drinker had a full pint of liquor in it, all of which is a far cry from the low alcohol and low calorie brew called Bud Light. These 2 beverages, to a degree, bookend our conversation, from the early local and handmade to the present day global and factory produced. And for the next hour, we're going to talk about America's long, complicated relationship with drink. Now let me introduce our speakers, after which I'll engage them in a Q&A session, and then we'll have you, the audience, join in the session. If you have a question, please submit it to Elaine Allen at AEI.org. Let me spell that, ELAYNE.ALLEN@AEI.org. Or you can send it to us via Twitter with the hashtag AEI Prohibition, all one word. And you need not wait until the Q&A portion of the program starts. If you have questions already, start popping them into the queue and we'll get to them. Now let me introduce our speakers. We have Dr. Christine Sismondo, who is the author of Prohibition, a 6-part podcast series for Wondery's American History Tellers. She is also author of a marvelous book called America Walks into a Bar. She also wrote Canadian Spirits with co-author Steve Beaumont and Mondo Cocktail, a shaken and stirred history. She's a National Magazine Award-winning writer and a columnist for the Toronto Star. And she's been writing about spirits, bars, and history for a range of publications, including the Globe, Mail, Plains, for 20 years. She also acts as a judge for the World Gin and Vodka Awards and is an Academy Chair for the World's 50 Best Bar competition. And she lives in Toronto, Canada. Also with us today is Dr. Scott Martin, a professor of history at Bowling Green State University. He is a social and cultural historian who specializes in the 19th century United States and the history of drugs and alcohol. He is the editor of the massive 3-volume Sage Encyclopedia of Alcohol, and the author of of the Domestic Sphere, Temperance, Gender, and Middle Class Ideology, 1800 to 1860. And he's written many other volumes and studies, and he's joining us from Ohio. Last but certainly not least, my friend and former colleague, Jarrett Dieterle, a senior fellow at the R Street Institute. He's a regulatory attorney by training and has co-authored Supreme Court briefs. Jarrett's the author and editor of drinksreform.org, a website and weekly newsletter dedicated to alcohol policy developments, as well as the person who wrote the recently published book, Give Me Liberty and Give Me a Drink. Jarrett also hosts the Right to Drink podcast series, and he's joining us from Richmond, Virginia. Welcome to you all. Now, I want to introduce this massive topic of drink to our audience, which has such a rich and long history. My inclination is naturally to start at the beginning. And to that end, I want to pitch my first question to Christine. In your book, America Walks Into a Bar, you wrote that taverns were, quote, absolutely critical to the survival, end quote, of early European settlers in America. That might strike the modern listener as remarkable and peculiar. So why did you write that? What roles did taverns play in early America?
Thank you for having me, by the way. This is really fun, and I appreciate it. And great question to start it off. There's a wonderful quote that I discovered through Wayne Curtis, who's another alcohol historian initially. And it was about about how the very first thing that Brits put up in every settlement was a tavern. The Dutch, they would build a fort, the Spaniards, they build a church, but the Brits always put a tavern up. And I kind of think of it as our as the British colonials' kind of secret weapon, which is, if you put the tavern up, it can stand in for all of the other missing infrastructure. It was used in defense during the American Revolution. It was used as a post office, as an inn, as a place of commerce, as a place to go and settle things out of court, so to speak, before you had, while you were still building the courthouse. So it's a really interesting kind of development.
Yeah, unlike Europe, where they had all these pre-existing institutions, Americans, those who would become Americans, had to build them from scratch. And so multi-purposing a tavern was one of the things they did. I mean, I was absolutely stunned. I'd known that, early postmasters also tended to be barkeeps, but you described how judicial proceedings, people getting hauled in for court for one crime or another, or a dispute amongst neighbors, that those things were also being hashed out in taverns.
And this stuff doesn't really show up in the history books, obviously, so much, or in our normal kind of history class. I mean, but as you sort of delve into it, after high school, and you start to figure out the role that the tavern played, you realize that it was fairly obvious how it was going to play out, because it's the warmest place in town. So, are you going to be convinced to go and into a building that sat empty all day in order to settle some court case, or are you just going to go to where everyone's been all day warming it up? I mean, and if you live in California, it might not be so obvious, but if you live where I live, if you're in the Northeast somewhere, you realize how important these considerations actually are. And to me, the most important kind of confluence of activities is the idea that people are debating legal arguments, they're receiving their mail, they're receiving news, and people from out of town are coming in. And so you have all of these things kind of happening at once. And this is a really vibrant, vital public space. And really, I would argue, a communications hub, like the proto-internet of the day. And so they become really important spaces to colonials.
Yeah, just to follow up on that a bit more, these early taverns in America, and they were erecting these things in the 1600s, at least that early, they serve various public purposes. And government very quickly took an interest in them. And, I recall there was at least one state that mandated certain towns, or all towns, have a tavern. they said you had to do it because it was considered a part of the political and commercial infrastructure.
Mm-hmm. And part of the key to understanding this to some degree is that beer was not necessarily considered a sin. Beer would have had a different sort of cultural space in that era, in that it would have been important for Europeans used it as a way to rehydrate, and certain people would have thought of it as a medicine. And in certain cases, it could give you a little bit of nourishment too, especially in the cold. So it wasn't, exactly the same as, doing a shot of Jaeger in today. It's a sort of a different cultural idea of alcohol, at least, when it comes to ale.
Excellent. Actually, yes. And that nicely sets me up for a question I want to send away to Scott, which is, we moderns tend to think of alcohol as something you consume at, moments of leisure or special celebrations, a sporting event, a wedding, perhaps the end of the day, like I put in a good day of work, so I'm going to celebrate with a beverage. That's not the way it was in early America. Their relationship with drink was a bit different. I wonder if you could just describe that a bit.
Sure, and thanks for having me here today. One of the factors that was not just mentioned is that for much of the very early colonial period, the water that you could get was not necessarily healthy, so that beer or distilled liquor was much healthier in that the bacteria in it would have been killed in the fermenting or distilling process. So before coffee, certainly, or even tea, were items that the had started their day with ale or with a drink of some other fermented or distilled beverage. So it was much more integrated into the culture in a whole variety of ways than it was now. And there wouldn't have been necessarily as much of a distinction made between fermented and distilled beverages as there are now. Beer is now considered, as in Bud Light, a lighter beverage than, say, whiskey or rum. But at the time, they didn't really distinguish between those because they all would have been, in many cases, better than the water you would get to drink. So is that sort of what you were getting at?
Yeah, absolutely. And that the fact that they were in most instances, not all, in most instances, having to make their own drink with what was available on hand. Now, I should say, of course, there were imports coming from Europe of Madeira and other sorts of stuff. But for the most part, people were having to produce their own stuff, which means, whatever is growing on the trees at the time, either you eat it or you brew it or distill it, because the last thing you want to do is throw it away, because times were lean back then. So you had drinks being made out of persimmons, for example. You had bark being used to flavor alcoholic beverages. There's really this kind of, when you look at early drinks, there was a scavenging of sorts. And it didn't seem to like there was a whole lot of difference between thinking about drink as a separate category from food. Is that right?
To a certain extent, yes. I think that's true. It certainly would have been part of the diet. And a significant amount of calories, vitamins, other nutrients would be present in things like beer or ale that might have been difficult to get elsewhere. So yeah, I think it's fair to say it was more part of a person's diet than we think of it.
Right. Let me follow up on that, because you, Scott, have done so much research and writing on drink's role in the social fabric in early America. What was the relationship between religion in early America and strong drink? I came across an anecdote when I was studying up for this event that was kind of eye-popping, where I read that a Reverend Joseph McKean was ordained in 1785 in a Massachusetts town. And prior to the ceremony, they served up 30 bowls of punch to the 80 attendees at the ceremony. And then they had a celebratory dinner afterwards, and another 44 bowls of punch was served along with 18 bottles of wine and 8 bowls of brandy. It was just kind of mind-blowing, but that, there was this relationship, but at the same time, there were clearly social problems that created tensions. I wonder if you could elaborate on that.
Mm-hmm. Sure. We normally think of the Puritans as, well, puritanical, as kind of, very serious people who discouraged any kind of frivolity or fun. That's not really accurate. The Puritans, and really it would have been the same in the southern colonies as well, viewed liquor, hard liquor, or fermented beverages as what they would have called a good creature of God, something that God had given humanity to be used in all of the ways that we've been talking about, for nutrition, but also for recreation. Drinking made you feel good. And the Puritans and the Anglicans in the Virginia colony, for example, not have begrudged that to anyone. Since this was a gift of God, it was to be used by people and enjoyed by people. They distinguished between the simple use of alcohol and the overuse of it. So a drunkard was a bad thing. In a famous 1673 sermon, Increase Mather, called Woe to Drunkards, he makes the point that alcohol is from God, but drunkenness is from the devil. So the excessive use of alcohol, like the excessive use of food or the excessive pursuit of wealth, was a sin, but it had nothing to do with the substance itself. It was the way in which human beings used it. And it could be used in moderation and in perfect accord with the dictates of God, or it could be abused sinfully and cause all sorts of social uproar, but also be bad for your eternal soul as well. So there was not the same disapproving stance that much of American religion would take later on toward alcohol. This was just not the case during much of the colonial period.
Yeah, that's a very, very interesting point, and I should put a pin in it. We might want to refer to it once we get up to the point where we're talking about the temperance and then prohibitionist type movements, because it seems that there was a shift in the thinking there. Returning to you, Christine, one of the interesting themes about alcohol throughout American history, but it became apparent in the early days of the country, is the tension between the sort of public authorities, be they church-based or secular authorities, and what happens at taverns. Who goes and what gets discussed there. And that, taverns ultimately become this place which are a kind of cauldron of politics. And I wonder if you could elaborate on that, especially how the role taverns ended up playing in the American, when we get up to the American Revolutionary period.
I mean, to me, this is what really led me down the path of looking at bars and looking at taverns in the first place, was just that traveling around the United States a fair bit. I am actually a dual citizen, but I was spending a lot of time in the United States, and especially East Coast cities. And, you'd often run across a plaque somewhere that said, this is the American Revolution was here. And then, this revolution or this battle or the Whiskey Rebellion, and even the Stonewall Rebellion, to see that, in New York City having a plaque there, or they do now, probably not at the time when I was looking into it. But to see that these politics had kind of, yes, indeed fermented in bars, and that really got me curious, and I wanted to know exactly why that had happened in that way. And putting the pieces together, it does feel to me like drink plays a role, absolutely, in that there's that William James quote about how drink says yes, drink opens you up. There is that lack of inhibitions that lets people talk about things that they might not normally be talking about. But again, that this spectacular role that they played almost through an accident of history for fulfilling all these other functions and getting all of these people in to talk about the news of the day. And, if you're just at home, like we all have been for the last 8 months, reading the news of the day, there's only sort of so much that you're going to do about it. But if you wind up talking about it to the guy next to you, and then you get a whole bar room debating it, that's the seeds of something that can turn into something, much more, depending on how you look at it, dangerous or promising, depending on your point of view. Obviously, the Brits wished that their secret weapon of tavern building to colonize didn't backfire on them, but it did. And they were absolutely essential. And, when people started, this was kind of a relatively obscure academic topic. I don't know, maybe 15 or 20 years ago. Scott could probably tell me better. But now, Hamilton has a scene where they're in the tavern and they're drinking about the story of tonight, and we'll remember this was the important moment. So I think it's a really fascinating kind of thing that's happened, and it's not unique, of course, to America or Canada. It's just a very showy demonstration of the power of what a tavern can do.
Yeah, I think the contrast between Europe, where we tend to associate, 17th, 18th, 19th century politics as bubbling up out of, coffee and tea houses, as opposed to America, where yes, we had some of that for certain, but that taverns were these places where people were coming in to get information they didn't know about, and then reacting to one another based upon it. And that certain bars became kind of associated with different political factions, like those who wanted liberty from Britain. They had their own bars, and they were, sign outside to signal as much.
Mm-hmm. And if you only have one print item, and people have to read it out loud, like before the American Revolution, the Thomas Paine tracts were read aloud in bars. I mean, that's just bound to get people riled up. It's, sort of like a reading propaganda night after night in the tavern while people are drinking. It's a pretty spectacular little moment.
So I want to bring Jared into the conversation. I want to bring him in at arguably the earliest federal policy involving alcohol, which was in George Washington's administration, and involved the effort to impose a tax. Now, as background, it's worth mentioning that when it came to regulating drink, hitherto, that had been a state and local issue. Who could go to taverns, what the price of drinks could be, et cetera, how many feather beds a tavern had to have, all those sorts of things. Those were taken care of at the local and state level. But then we have the federal government recently created decide it's going to drop a tax to raise revenue. And how'd that go, Jarrett?
It's funny we were mentioning Alexander Hamilton, and I know anyone can't speak ill about him today. It was the successful musical, but he was kind of the right-hand man as Treasury Secretary that was pushing for the tax as part of his overarching plan to pay off Revolutionary War debt. And he really made two mistakes, which are I guess, not terribly surprising in retrospect of looking at it from now in the history of American politics. But he, first of all, the way the tax was designed, it fell disproportionately on small distillers, this excise tax, primarily ones that were in more rural parts of the country, and also did not have really cash on hand. A lot of times that part of the American economy at the time operated almost without money. It operated more by a barter system at times. The second mistake is they thought it would be popular, which I guess every politician or government official thinks their policy will be popular. It ended up being tremendously unpopular. Again, mostly because of the people, the farmers in rural America at the time, which had stills at every other farm back then, and it's very hard, I think, for us to understand and conceptualize now why that would be. But a lot of them lived in mountainous regions in Western Pennsylvania, in particular, that were very difficult to access. Travel in and out was complicated. It was very difficult at that time to haul massive amounts of crops and grains that they were growing from where they were growing it to where the people actually were on the East Coast cities at the time. And because of that, they tried to look for other products, I guess, to be able to make a living off of. And they realized that if they distilled the grains that they were making and growing on their farms, that they could get a lot more money for them, and it was a lot easier to ship them, and they also didn't spoil over time if they were in a distilled bottle. And so it was very popular for them to have stills at these farms. And once they got taxed on it, it really angered them. And the tax in large part was not very well enforced. Western Pennsylvania, they did find a person that was willing to go out into the field and try to collect it. It didn't go super well. It led to a lot of intimidation of the tax collectors that were involved in it, and eventually led to the Whiskey Rebellion, which is something that a lot of people talk about today as kind of an early example of one part of government trying to do a policy that was tremendously unpopular and kind of led to this populist uprising. And so since then, I always like to joke that in America, government and alcohol have had this kind of frenemy relationship since then, pretty much, the Whiskey Rebellion to today.
Yes, and speaking of federal government and drink, those of you who are on Twitter, if you take a look at my account at Kevin R. Kosar, or if you just search for the pound AEI prohibition, you'll see that I included a link to an article about the long, complicated relationship that U.S. military and alcohol have had. As one anecdote to illustrate, during the Revolutionary War, George Washington wrote to Congress frequently. He was always asking Congress for stuff because his men out in the fields needed stuff. But one thing he asked for was Bibles to help keep their spirits up. And he also asked for a daily alcohol ration. He requested at one point that each soldier have a gill of alcohol, spirits, no less, a day. A gill was around 4 or 5 ounces. And that they also be given enough alcohol that for those who are really high performers, that they could get bonus drinks. And at a later point in the revolution, George Washington wrote to Congress and requested that Congress erect a distillery to make whiskey that could supply the troops. So that history of the federal government and drink looking upon it as an ally for military purpose, that carries way, way forward all the way through the 19th century. And ultimately it became something that is now kind of a commercialized enterprise on military bases where you have the various shops where drink is sold. But let me move on and go to Scott again. You're the editor of a volume titled Cultural Change and the Market Revolution in America, 1789 to 1860. We've been talking a lot about drink as a kind of social thing or an agricultural product, but it was clearly a good that was bought and sold. Most infamously, alcohol played a role in the triangular trade of the time. But could you tell us a bit about what role alcohol had in the market revolution or commercial revolution?
Sure. Just to follow up on the point you just made about alcohol in the military, one of the reasons that Washington, for example, wanted to issue a daily ration was because of a misunderstanding about the nature of alcohol. Up until the 19th century, most physicians, scientists assumed that alcohol was a stimulant because it makes you feel stimulated at first. When you drink it, it makes you feel warmer. It in fact isn't, as we all know now, but there was a prevalent belief that you needed alcohol if you were going to exert yourself in inclement weather, in the cold. Tremendous physical exertion required alcohol to sort of recruit the system. So that's one of the reasons that it was issued in the military. At the same time, the Army outlaws the daily alcohol ration in 1832, and the Navy does so in 1862, I believe, during the Civil War. So there was also recognition that this was not necessarily good for military discipline. But to get back to the market revolution is essentially in the early 19th century, the opening decades of the 19th century, the extension of market relationships to areas of the country and their intensification in urban areas in ways that had never occurred before. So we were just talking about the Whiskey Rebellion, and one of the reasons for it was that distilled whiskey served as a kind of currency in Western Pennsylvania. With the market revolution, market relationships, cash nexus, became much more common in all parts of the United States, so that you really could no longer, even if you wanted to be a subsistence farmer, you could no longer really do it because you could no longer barter for goods and services that you needed, and you probably would also have to pay taxes, which would have to be paid in cash. So the ramifications for alcohol with this is simply that what went along with it were improvements, both technological and organizational, in the transmission of information and transportation. So the market revolution opens up markets for grain to be distilled into whiskey. It makes the transshipment of distilled easier throughout the United States, but at the same time, it also makes much easier through both technology and organization, steam printing presses, new sorts of paper that was much cheaper but durable. It also made it possible for the temperance movement to really saturate the nation with newspapers, pamphlets, tracts, all sorts of things militating against the use of alcohol that had been from about 1790 to 1830. Americans drank more than they ever have in terms of the amount of absolute alcohol. During that period, Americans drank roughly double what they do today. So there was, on one hand, both this expanding market that made cheap whiskey readily available all over the country, and it also caused a genuine problem that then the temperance movement responded to, also using newly available technology and market relationships.
Thank you. That's great. And that actually sets me up very nicely to pivot over to Christine. Prohibition and its repeal is the occasion for this panel. I wondered if you could review for the audience, like, how do we get from a place where people looked upon alcohol as a normal part of daily life, used in religious ceremonies, used for toasting, breakfast, to a place where we're passing constitutional amendments to ban its sale and production?
I could give a really long answer here, but I'll try to narrow it down to what I think are maybe the most important elements. Just sort of following up on what Scott said, there was a real problem, and we do have to recognize this, and prohibition is often framed as sort of some busybody religious women who were just trying to take away everyone's fun. And this is not, this is a not sort of accurate way to think about the massive epidemic problems of domestic abuse, child abandonment, poverty that was being caused by alcohol at some point that started some of these movements towards moving up towards prohibition. Very slowly. It was a very, very long period of time before you actually got to a spot where a constitutional amendment happened. And I would say that a fair bit of it has to do with encroachment of industrialization and needing to have workplaces that were safer. If you're operating heavy machinery, you really can't have people hungover or, actually drunk from drinking beer in the morning and going out for lunch that involves several drinks. And I think that there are some real issues involved here. And I feel that a lot of it had to do with business interests recognizing that the modern world was going to require different things. You have people driving cars, you have all sorts of issues that alcohol is intersecting with in a negative way. But to me, more than anything, the anti-immigrant sort of sentiment in that era is the thing that sort of pushed it over the edge and made it a viable political option to be able to pass a constitutional amendment for. I think if it weren't for a sort of groundswell of anti-immigrant sentiment that the prohibition, the women as well as the men were feeding to a great degree, you probably wouldn't have seen it become a reality, because that was a huge thing. To be able to pull a constitutional amendment is not an easy thing. And it took 30 years of the anti-saloon league campaigning to make it happen.
Yeah, and if I may follow up with you on that, Christine, you'd mentioned the anti-immigrant aspect. One thing I learned from your research was that who was allowed to go into taverns? Was it only men? Was it women? Was it non-white men, etc.? That was a heavy political controversy, and there was a lot of power struggles around that. And I know it's a huge thing, and that it spans centuries. But I wonder if you could just give our audience a little flavor of the politics of gender and multiracial access to bars.
I think that one of the other things is because we're sort of trapped in this idea of a model of progress, we tend to think, women weren't allowed to drink in bars. And then suddenly in 1975, after McSorley's became a big issue, they were. And of course, it didn't actually play out that way. If it did, history would be a lot easier to understand and teach. But, many colonial taverns would have been owned by women. And really, you start to see there's probably no period in which women didn't go into bars in certain contexts, depending on class, ethnicity, a number of different factors. But it did become less acceptable for women, say white middle class women from 1850 on to go into saloons.
Gotcha. All right, so I want to move forward because I want to get to audience questions with kind of the post-prohibition landscape, and I want to toggle back to Jarrett. The 21st Amendment ended the noble experiment, but it's a kind of peculiar amendment, not least because it hangs in tension with the Constitution's Commerce Clause, and that's had some ramifications. Could you talk a bit about that?
Yeah, it's another thing that could have an unwieldy answer, so I'll try to keep it short. But when the 21st Amendment was enacted, it granted quite a bit of power to state and local governments over alcohol. A lot of that sentiment still existed. A lot of states, in a nutshell, passed systems and legal structures to still control access to alcohol, how it's sold, who could make it, what different tiers of the distribution system you could own. And as America's economy became more interconnected and things were going across state lines more as technology developed, and of course today with the internet, it's at an all-time high. There was a doctrine of in constitutional law to kind of prioritize interstate commerce under the Commerce Clause, as you mentioned. And these two things, and this is again a thumbnail sketch of this, but they ended up colliding essentially, and it's led to a series of court decisions and constitutional interpretations where people have kind of debated to what extent can states control their own borders with alcohol, forbid, for example, shipments from out-of-state breweries or distilleries to ship directly to state residents. Can they do that without violating the Commerce Clause and the idea that you can't burden interstate commerce in that way? So it can get very thorny and very complicated very quickly. The Supreme Court actually is considering again whether to weigh in on the issue in a court case that's currently in front of the docket. Probably in early January they're going to decide on it. But it's certainly become a big deal in COVID, right? We all want to order things and have it shipped to our door, and oftentimes that can be tricky across state lines in America. You might have a brewery that you love in Michigan, for example, and I live in Virginia, and they can't send it directly to me in large part because of that post-prohibition structure that was set up. So again, that's a 1,000-foot view of it. But yeah, we once prohibition was repealed, it left this legal structure that's really had ramifications to today.
Well, I do want to get to the audience questions, which are pouring in, but I've got one quick one to ask Christine. Since COVID came up and we're in this weird position where we're all being forced to hunker down and get through this, and that involves the topic near and dear to your heart, which is the taverns as a public space and bars, which have undergone a huge transformation in recent decades. The craft cocktail thing, but there's also the kind of TGII Fridays sort of mass production model, aims to produce drinks at a very accessible price and partner it with favorable foods. COVID's been here for a while. What are bars going to look like afterwards?
I really worry. I lost the bar that I worked at when I was going through university this year. It closed due to COVID. So it was a bit on the divier side of things. I worry about some of the bars that aren't part of chains, that aren't franchises, that don't have any kind of corporate funding. I worry especially about dive bars, but I think that we are going to lose some. Well, I know we are because we have. But I feel like the general sort of concept of going to a bar and having a human, not a robot, not a self-dispensing machine, and talking to other people has an excellent chance of rebounding quickly. I mean, I'm ready to go to a bar. I don't know about anybody else, but I just think that it's really, taverns have existed for far longer than restaurants, which are a fairly modern invention, the modern restaurant. Taverns arguably go back to the Roman days when they were essential to building an empire there. So I think that they'll be back, That's
Good.
my money's on that.
Kevin, can I make a point about prohibition?
Yes, please do.
I think in your intro, you kind of portrayed this as a minority coalition, kind of pulling the wool over the eyes of Americans. And, I think you have to temper that with the notion that there had been state prohibition, local prohibition throughout much of the United States by the 1910s. So by the time the 18th Amendment is passed, much of the United States is dry by that point. So this was widely popular. Many Americans believed in prohibition. Some of the other things that made it possible, I think, was the passage of the 16th Amendment a few years before the Income Tax Amendment. Since prior to that, about 30% of US revenue came from taxation of alcohol. You could only have prohibition if somehow that revenue was going to be replaced. And then, finally, probably the linchpin that made prohibition possible when it happened was World War I. Again, sort of riffing on anti-immigrant, in this case, anti-German American feeling, but also prohibition forces could make the case that grain should not be distilled for whiskey. It's needed for the troops. It's needed for the people at home. So being a prohibitionist meant that you were a patriot. So I think there's a whole lot more going on there. And also to simply say that it's a failure, by a lot of measures, the incidence of cirrhosis of the liver, the incidence of a variety of alcohol-related crimes, but also just, they decreased dramatically. And I think, when we think about prohibition, we also have to remember that as the result of prohibition, the overall rate of American consumption of alcohol remained at pre-prohibition levels, below pre-prohibition levels, well into the 1970s. So simply, I would hate to simply consign prohibition as a failure when, there are a lot of extenuating factors, I think, that deserve a more complex look, I think. So.
Oh, yeah, absolutely. Absolutely. And I also throw in that prohibition was not just an American thing, obviously. I mean, prohibitions swept across various nations of Europe. And so this was something where I think those larger factors of the Industrial Revolution and, various social costs that were coming from, crazy levels of usage of it, this was happening in many places. No. All right, let me go to the first question, which perhaps I'll pitch to you, Scott. First audience question: how important was cider in colonial America, and was it a regional drink? Is that one you want to field, Scott, or would you like that one, Christine? Which looks like you're on mute, Scott. Go ahead, Christine. All right.
Oh, I thought Scott was answering it.
No, that's okay.
I'm not probably the world's expert on the history of cider. I wonder if Jarrett knows more than I do. This is like hot potato.
Yeah, I may not know as much as Scott, but it is cider. Fermented cider was immensely popular for a time. It was really the drink of choice, I guess, in early American history. There's a lot of famous examples of founding fathers. John Adams allegedly drank a gill of it every morning for breakfast, again before his walk. Scott's point that you needed alcohol for vigorous physical activity. A lot of, again, rural farmers planted orchards with the idea that then that would be converted into hard cider. A lot of the apple seeds that Johnny Appleseed, he maybe could have been Johnny Apple Cider Seed or something, was given to different people in early America, was to plant orchards. And so, cider played a very important role and eventually lost some of its luster with the advent of beer and the influx of German immigrants, including some of my ancestors probably, that brought beer to the U.S. Prohibition hurt obviously all alcohol, but it led to federal agents chopping down thousands and thousands of acres of apple orchards, actually. And apple orchards don't regrow overnight. That's about a 15-year regrowing process. So cider's been there from the beginning. It's been kind of fun to see that it's gotten a little bit of a bounce, kind of, I think, off the back of the recent craft brew revolution. So it's starting to come back a little bit. But yeah, in a nutshell, that's what I know about America's cider history.
Well, I do have another audience question that specifically references you, Scott, and notes that when you were discussing colonial period, alcohol in moderation was considered something from God, but drunkenness was from the devil. The implication possibly being that the problem lies more with what is referred to as binge drinking these days. And so the ask here is, can you discuss how binge drinking evolved over the 20th century and whether or not it had a role in driving the increase in recreational drug use that began in the 60s, or if these were just two separate substance tracks?
I would say they're two separate substance tracks. Binge drinking becomes a phenomenon really in the same period between 1790 and 1830, with this tremendous spike in drinking generally. And what's also occurring during this time, particularly in places like New England, there wasn't enough land to pass down to more than one son. And so people were heading to cities, people were moving further away to try and find more opportunities. And what this meant was that these close-knit colonial towns where everybody knew everybody else's business, and policing was kind of a social thing. So you wouldn't drink too much because everybody else would know about it. That kind of social surveillance tends to lessen, particularly with urbanization, cities being much more anonymous. And one of the many phenomena that are associated with that are, on the one hand, binge drinking, but also solitary drinking. So this is occurring way back in the 19th century and just continues to be a problem periodically as it is today. But I don't see that that's really directly linked to drug use in any meaningful way.
Okay, thank you. Looks like this question is for Christine. What would the earliest Americans who dealt with a kind of whole host of drinks, rules, and laws think about the system of rules and regulations that we have today? How's that for a curveball?
It's a great question.
Peace and contrasts.
You know, I mean, I can't say for sure because I don't have the time traveling machine with me, but I do think that some of the laws would look interesting to a person who was used to a tavern in Ontario, for example. They would have been open 24/7. So many places, and you know that this sort of idea about hours and certain hours being important for licensing, I think to me that's the first thing that stands out as a law that might have looked a little bit different to people who would have had an ale at breakfast, as a very normal thing, to sort of have this, like, you really can't drink until 5 p.m. when cocktail hour starts. That would have been, I think, the most, that's the thing that first comes to my mind.
Yeah, and at least some of the localities back then set prices. They were set by law what you could charge for various types of drink, which we don't quite have that, although we do have, some states do have an influence in the price setting. They have mandatory minimums and that sort of stuff. So there might be some element of familiarity there.
Yeah, absolutely.
Another question. Who defines what the types of alcohol are? Jarrett, do you want to take a bite at that apple?
Yeah, and the short answer is, as far as legal categories, the TTB gets to weigh in on the different categories and kind of define them through regulations. It's led to some interesting situations. You see it now actually with the advent of more American micro distillers starting to go into the single malt category. They can't call them Scotch because of trade agreements. It has to be from Scotland, but they want to make something very similar. So they've settled upon American single malt as kind of what they're going to call themselves. But the ones I've talked to are kind of want to get the TTB to recognize that, because they feel like if they do, not that liquor stores have to be beholden to, putting up a sign that says American single malt, but oftentimes that's kind of a little bit of a leader to the states, and then also like the private liquor stores to, maybe have a section of the liquor store, for example, that would be American single malt. Right now, those guys are thrown in with the bourbon, and it's not really the same thing. There's definitely a lot of issues around that. The TTB recently kind of reformed its definition of vodka as a flavorless, odorless spirit. They admitted that there was some flavor in vodka. So there's a long dynamic of the federal government trying to kind of define the different categories and what they mean and kind of how they are as spirits. And it can be important how your alcohol is classified. It can lead to determining what kind of regulatory set of rules will be applied to your alcohol, potentially, if it's defined as a wine or more of like a liqueur, for example. But yeah, that's a short answer. There's people that spend their whole lives studying TTB labeling regulations, but that's a short overview.
Yeah, one of the things that I learned when I was researching my whiskey book all those years ago was that the kind of pure food and drink movement in the progressive era, late 19th century, early 20th century, it also applied to drink, because when it came to alcoholic beverages, to some degree, it was vocabulary anarchy. People could call anything whatever they wanted. There was no shared definitions like across America, or for that matter, the UK, about what exactly is a whiskey, what can be put in it and what cannot be put in it. Are there steps that you have to take to manufacture it? And are there steps that are just optional? And that was something that the government had to step in and do, so that we could have, not only people knowing what they were buying, but it also created these kind of clear categories, so that if you're thirsting for a potent dark liquor that's rather sweet and made from grain, and you're okay, go for bourbon. If you're looking for something that's of a different flavor category, well, okay, buy your vodka, buy your brandy, or whatever it might be.
Yeah, it's important. I mean, just quickly, the Bottle and Bond Act was kind of the first iteration of that in the drinks market, which kind of defined, at that time, there was a lot of fake whiskey. People would take gin or vodka and then just color it like caramel color and put all kinds of gross stuff in it that wasn't whiskey. And that was an early example of them trying to define what whiskey was and kind of put a quality metric on it that we can't even relate to nowadays, as we're so spoiled with all the stuff that's available today.
Yeah, it's a good example of government and industry being able to collaborate in a way that actually created beneficial results all around: safer drink, better drink. Question came in. Looks like this one's for Christine. Interesting one. What influence did Prohibition have on the Canadian brewing industry?
Prohibition in Canada is very complicated because we did not have a federal law, but we did have prohibition in many provinces. All really, essentially. Although in Quebec it was about a 5-minute ordeal, whereas in Prince Edward Island it was nearly 50 years of prohibition. So it's actually very regional in terms of the effect that things had. For example, Montreal became a great destination for alco tourism, and parts of southern Ontario became great exporters, and a lot of stuff moved through St. Pierre and Miquelon into the United States during Prohibition, but that is actually not Canada. So Canada gets the credit for doing a lot more smuggling than it actually did. But on the border towns, there were breweries and there were bars that were set up in every province where it was legal. Not in Ontario, not so much, because we didn't actually have an end to legal alcohol. Illegal alcohol came in 27 here. So it really depends. It's a very complicated question, and I could do this for about 4 hours if we still wouldn't have a clear answer.
Thank you. We're down to our last audience question, and this one is going to Jarrett Dieterle. What sort of policy changes have we seen in drink since the arrival of COVID?
Yeah, I touched upon it earlier. The short answer is a lot. The whole prioritization of being able to get stuff delivered to our doors obviously ran headfirst into a lot of the restrictions on alcohol delivery and shipment, both interstate, as I alluded to earlier, but also intrastate within a state. A lot of states do not authorize distilleries or grocery stores, for example, to send distilled spirits or beer or wine to your door. So it's led to a vast rethinking of that. And I think a lot of Americans kind of started asking why they couldn't get something as simple as a bottle of bourbon shipped to their door when they can get all kinds of ridiculous stuff sent to them. Like pickle flavor lip balm is my favorite. It's a thing you can order on Amazon, but you can't get bourbon shipped to you. So it's led to that question being asked, and now we're starting to see a lot of government officials responding with things like to-go cocktails and delivery alcohol from places. And maybe open container laws are going to start getting some kind of a revisit. We'll see. That I think might be the next step, as more people are drinking outside because they can't be inside. So we'll see. But yeah, that's it's definitely upended the legal structure of alcohol in the 21st century.
Yeah, it sounds like it's to some degree taking a step forward. Some of the changes we've seen in the last 20 years around Christine used the phrase alco-tourism, where, now in order to attract tourists to particular places, they're allowing distilleries to serve cocktails on premise or sell their bottles direct. They're kind of altering the three-tier system in ways for the sake of fostering commerce. Well, with that, I need to thank you all for this terrific panel. Dr. Christine Sismondo, thank you so much.
Thank you.
Scott Martin, thank you. Jarrett, thank you. And thank you to the audience out there who joined us today. And Prohibition's no longer here, but clearly this is a live topic. And as Jarrett mentioned, the history of Prohibition is to some degree with us, but also the earliest Americans' relationship to drink, that history is still with us too. So thank you all.